Good afternoon. Thank you everyone for coming today. This is the 6th World Order Colloquium of the Reimagining World Order community. We're very pleased today to host a distinguished international historian, Professor Vladislav Zubok of the London School of Economics, historian of Russia and the Soviet Union, author of numerous award-winning books, including A Failed Empire, Zhivago's Children, The Idea of Russia, and most recently, of course, in 2022, Collapse, The Fall of the Soviet Union. And today we're very happy Professor Zubok will be presenting his book and using the book to contextualize the present war in Ukraine. Thank you so much, Professor Zubok, for coming. In terms of the format, we're going to follow the standard format for these colloquia. After Professor Zubok's talk, we'll shift to a Q&A with the in-person audience as well as our audience on Zoom. Please feel free to leave your questions in the online chat, and my colleague Wuzhan Zhang will select your questions and then put them to our speaker. And then around 5:50 or so, closer to 6 o'clock, there will be an in-person reception just outside for everyone here. Okay, thank you so much. Professor Zubok, I'll leave it to you.
Okay, can you hear me now? I don't want to, okay. I will speak normally and hopefully you will hear me. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here at Princeton, particularly after 3 years of calamitous events when it seemed like travel would never come back to this planet. But, somehow across the Atlantic, thinking about this talk. And let me start by saying that future historians, no doubt, will ask themselves a question: where to begin this narrative of the war, the Ukrainian-Russian war? And my answer to this is maybe rather disappointing and simple. It's the fatal weakening of the Soviet center by Gorbachev's reforms. And I don't want to compete with my own book, and just urge you, if you want more details and more coherent explanation, to go to the book. So in much less coherent way, I'll try to explain what I mean by fatal weakening of the center. The Soviet Union was a strange creature. Of course, some of us still remember it, but it was very difficult to imagine such a construction to collapse so thoroughly and so suddenly, because if, in terms of architecture, I think it had really many props. Yes, it has structural weaknesses that everyone likes to point to nowadays, but it had very serious props, not to mention the Communist Party, planned economy, so-called planned, but in reality, highly centralized economy, with Soviet ministers really controlling most of the assets, all major assets actually on the territories of all 15 republics. And Ukraine was not an exception. We know, of course, that over 75%, and some economic historians would say even more, of major economic assets, including 1/3 of the Soviet military-industrial complex, was on the territory of Ukraine. But directors and managers of those factories and plants, as well as nuclear plants like Chernobyl, they didn't look to Kiev, they looked to Moscow. So there was, of course, ideology that was the most vulnerable part of it, and there were sinews of power. There were army, KGB, and those sinews of power actually, as the research shows, remained remarkably intact until the very last months of the Soviet Union. So they were still there. They were demoralized. They, not leaderless in many ways, but they were there, and it could have been used under different circumstances. So my main conclusion, and that's a sort of part one of my speech, not to worry, I have only 2 parts, is that Gorbachev's perestroika weakened the center by misguided reforms. And in a sense, those reforms are well known. I will quickly repeat them. The very well-known law on state enterprises and cooperatives and some banking reforms. But what those reforms aimed to do, they aimed to unleash entrepreneurial energy somehow without passing the threshold from socialism to capitalism. In other words, it was Gorbachev's dream to re-energize the existing socialist economy. And it is remarkably clear, particularly when you compare it to Deng Xiaoping's reforms, how it backfired. In China, as we know, Deng Xiaoping began equally erratically, without any strategy, without any plan, but it sort of allowed peasantry to produce and sell and have parts of the profits, and in this way unleashed some energy of tens of millions and later hundreds of millions of people that later on allowed China to grow gradually out of the market, which was not a pleasant picture. We know there are problems, and one particular problem on Tiananmen Square, 1989, but you know, it went on somehow. Gorbachev did it inside the existing economy. In other words, he unleashed the energy of people who did not create a new economy. They hollowed out the old one. And, you know, it's remarkable that how few people at the time understood it, including Gorbachev himself, including Prime Minister Nikolai Ryzhkov, who was the main architect of those reforms. Gorbachev gave political backing to those reforms for his own reasons, but Ryzhkov and a group of Soviet economists constructed those reforms. And there are very few people who pointed to them that there was a real systemic problem with those reforms. At the end of 1989, practically simultaneously with the fall of the Berlin Wall, by the way, there was a discussion of how actually much more serious danger to Soviet security was inside. And it was, you know, looming economic crisis. Well, you know, if current reforms were to continue, some economists wrote, in 2-3 years, that would be a collapse. Well, the collapse happened in well, exactly in 2 years, you know, not 3, 2. So Gorbachev didn't do anything because he didn't want to. He didn't want to. He was afraid that by making a sharp turn or a U-turn from the already existing set of reforms, he would compromise the entire perestroika, and that he was afraid of emboldening so-called conservative forces inside the party, inside the bureaucracy, because in his political imagination, of course, those forces were the main braking mechanism торможения, that prevented his reforms from working. So he misunderstood the reforms, but practically everyone did. There were a few guys who turned out to be bad guys, such as Prime Minister Pavlov, Minister of Finances. He perfectly understood what was happening. He later on joined the coup makers in August 1991. So it's not convenient to mention him as a clairvoyant guy, but I do in my book. At least he deserves some mention for this. You know, Gorbachev and his reformers continued full speed forward, not only misdiagnosing the outcome of the reforms, but also misdiagnosing which factors actually were at the core of the problem. They thought the party was at the core of the problem, and it was really not. So a combination of political and economic reforms continued to feed on each other and creating a unique, I would say, unique destabilizing effect in the Soviet Union that cannot be explained just by looking at one aspect or one part of what Gorbachev did. So normally, you know, some authors do that. They either look at the fall of the Berlin Wall and write about the effect it had on the Soviet Union, or they focus on economy, or they focus on political reforms. But you know, I argued in the book that was a unique conflation of those forces that created absolutely unprecedented destructive storm inside the Soviet Union. I would add very briefly, because I don't want to go into this, and I can answer your questions if you want to learn a bit more about my approach to this. That all was taking place at an interesting time in the history of international relations or international order, as Tola encouraged me to raise this issue. Well, that in a sense, sometimes I think of Gorbachev, not in the way my dear friend William Taubman thinks, as a tragic figure, but in a different sense. Gorbachev came too late. Gorbachev came 15 years too late, not in the sense that Soviet reforms should have been done 15 years earlier. Of course, the sooner, the better. But had he appeared, let's say, in the early 70s, had he appeared even better in the late 60s, he would have had a different world, different liberal order, with more people understanding him, at least trying to help him in a meaningful way. But he encountered very harsh world, I would say. It could have been harsher, no doubt, but it was a rather cold and harsh world of neoliberal Washington consensus. And it is striking how this aspect overlapped with what we assume, of course, as a traditional animosity and mistrust towards the Soviet Union that existed in some Western corners, but particularly in this country, particularly in Washington, D.C. and in the U.S. government. Don't forget that in September 1989, Bob Gates from the CIA came up with an infamous speech, but basically saying that Gorbachev probably would fail. The probability is very high that whatever he does would fail, because he runs not only against 70 years of Soviet history, he runs against 1,000 years of Russian history. So, the entire history of Russia is wrong, completely wrong, 1,000 years, nothing good about it. It's 100% path dependency that Gorbachev, in his strange fancy of imagination, tried to confront, and of course he would fail. I mean, what's interesting that it reflected not only the accumulated Cold War hostility inside the Bush administration and, of course, Reagan administration, with one exception from this consensus, I would say late Reagan, and I would say Bush, beginning probably from the moment when he met Gorbachev at Malta in December 1989. But everyone around the administration shared this consensus, and also the Washington consensus reinforced that extreme skepticism about what Gorbachev could or could not do, or rather couldn't do, because Russia is a country that never knew liberalism, never was a trade state, but always was a militarist state, a heavily militarized autocratic state, accumulating resources to compete on international arenas. So, according to Washington consensus, the only way for such a state, for such a country to move meaningfully forward would be to completely dismantle the military-industrial complex. As Nicholas Brady said, and I quoted him in his book in one of the discussions, Russia should become a third-rate power. By the way, when he said Russia, he meant the Soviet Union. There's always confusion about who meant what, but it was the entire Soviet Union. And of course, later Russia had to become a third-rate power, open up its borders, transform its, I don't know what, cultural, genetical, other codes, and become someone else. Naturally, having these steep, completely impossible demands, everyone around Bush thought it's madness. It's pretty impossible. So nevertheless, the question is why Bob Gates got such a cold shower in September 1989. Because Scowcroft was scandalized, he dressed him down and all that. It's well-known fact, but in fact, when you read the polemic around it, it was at the same time when the administration concluded that the Soviet Union is on a sort of slippery slope, probably, and may even collapse. They create a special group actually to explore the possibility. What should we do if the main structures of the Soviet Union collapse? What should we do? At the same time, Bush, Scowcroft, and others in the American administration came up with a brilliant idea to use Gorbachev and Shevardnadze as, how to put it, the helpers to guide the Soviet Union forward, even though the Soviet Union, as Clinton later put it elegantly, would end up on the ash heap of history. So you have intense pessimism about the chances of Gorbachevian reforms to succeed, combined with this very smart idea, okay, if we keep Gorbachev in power for as long as it takes, we'll be able to lock in various gains that Gorbachev was prepared to give to us, such as, of course, Eastern Europe, such as primarily reduction of nuclear arms. And if you look at the documentation, the Soviet Union was asking increasingly about economic aid, financial aid from the West, but the United States kept turning it down. And the entire focus on the American side was on arms reductions and basically denuclearizing the Soviet Union to an extent possible, helping to dismantle the military-industrial complex. Why I'm speaking about it? Because I just want, first of all, to put the Russian-Ukrainian rift and divorce and conflict into a proper context, both uniqueness of domestic implosion of the center caused by Gorbachev, call it, vision, illusions, whatnot, but pretty unique combination of subjective and structural factors that happened at that time. Highly unlikely to happen again. I'm saying all this because people always ask me, when are you going to write the second collapse? With Putin being in the center, chances are minimal. It will be a different collapse, perhaps, but not like this. Not like this. So very quickly to the inquiry about the roots of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. Yes, you have already wonderful books written about it. Tamar Basinger wrote about the nationalist tide that consumed the Soviet Union from the margins, reached the center. Very elegant and very interesting book. Sergei Plokhy elucidated on the last months of the Soviet Union. Actually was the first to bring some interesting facts about the Russian-Ukrainian rift immediately after August 1991. And, I would argue that Russia really played a unique role in all this story. Someday, if I meet Putin, I would tell him, you know who destroyed the Soviet Union, Vladimir? You and your people, Russians. So, because if you look at all factors of nationalism, a nationalist movement existing in the Soviet Union until let's say June 1990, we have the Baltic republics, of course, unique case. They wanted out, naturally. But they never dreamed of getting out. You would ask anyone, Landsbergis or anyone, of course we wanted out, but we stood no chance without, and they would also always say, Russians and Yeltsin. The same happened in South Caucasus, because Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, the trouble there was considerable, but I would say it was inter-ethnic trouble and territorial conflicts and anger that the center could not sort it out for them. Armenians wanted the center to give them Nagorno-Karabakh. You know, Azeris wanted the center to keep Nagorno-Karabakh, and so on and so forth. Georgians were angry and furious before Tbilisi massacre that somehow the reformed Soviet constitution recognized Abkhazia as almost equal subjects in the Soviet Union, and so on and so forth. Only at a certain time, all those republics developed fully separatist movements that really set the political goals of leaving the Soviet Union, but quite reluctantly, actually, because everyone understood economic costs and geopolitical problems related to it. So the little-known fact that started it all was the another constitutional reform, constitutional change that was passed somewhere around August, September 1989, and was the second phase of Gorbachevian political reform that consisted of removing the Communist Party from the center of everything. It used to be the pillar, the rod of sorts in economic, political, ideological, and other systems of the Soviet Union, and replace it with representative institutions such as Congress of People's Deputies and Supreme Soviet or Council of People's Deputies. And in August, September 89, the same was done as almost an inevitable second phase for the two key republics of the Soviet Union. One was the Russian Federation, and another was Ukraine. It was really a footnote in newspapers at the time. Yeah, there would be elections. There would be elections at the time. And of course, we know that in Ukraine, everything was nice and quiet. Nothing to, well, I'm sure Ukrainian historians would find something to write and to report in the future books, but it was in Russia where the real explosion took place in the form of March 1990 elections, in the form of wide participations of the Russians for the first time since 1917, the election to the Constitutional Assembly, and the creation in Moscow of a counter-elite in the form of RSFSR Congress and RSFSR Council. So Moscow became the seat of dual power very quickly. In Ukraine, nothing happened, nothing of major political or ideological importance. However, one event did take place. Gorbachev chided the Ukrainian party, the Ukrainian Communist Party, the branch of of course, the USSR party, for being so timid and so inactive to support perestroika. And he recommended to create a movement in support of the perestroika. Movement for Ukraine in Ukrainian is, of course, a ruch. And that movement, the ruch, in support of perestroika, was created by the Ukrainian Communist Party, by the Ukrainian KGB. All those dissidents, people released from prison in early Gorbachev years, were allowed to constitute themselves in a national movement, which of course was done early in the Baltic republics and backlashed against Gorbachev pretty quickly. So it looked like Gorbachev refused to recognize that whatever he did backlashed. The sorcerer's apprentice syndrome, and that created in Ukraine a potential danger for still very dominant Ukrainian communist nomenclature and communist party. But the Ukrainian communists were very dominant, very much dominant. The Ukrainian KGB was no better, no worse than other branches of the KGB. So everything was still under control. And back to economy, much of the economy responded to Moscow and to the center, into the union ministries, not to Kiev. Everything began to change because of Boris Yeltsin and the movement called the Democratic Russia, Demokraticheskaya Rossiya, formed in January 1990 with the explicit goal to use RSFSR structures or Russian Federation structures as a vehicle against this so-called totalitarian center. Totalitarian center was very much the language of the time by Russian Democrats, and Yeltsin absorbed this language, took over this language. So you see in the first half of 1990, the story is Russians are extremely active. Russians are on the march towards democracy and destroying the entire totalitarian empire and liberating, of course, everyone else in the process. That's their rhetoric. Ukrainians pretty much sitting and waiting and being very, very cautious and watching the growing rift in Moscow, growing duality of power in Moscow. There are different voices, I should say, right away among the Russian Democrats or Russian liberals. You know, in my view, there were neither Democrats nor liberals, but let me call them this name. Some of them, such as Andrei Sakharov's wife, Yelena Bonner, insisted on complete dismantling of the empire, complete decolonization of Russia. You know, when I read today in Twitter and other sources, decolonize Putin's Russia. I mean, they exactly verbatim what was said in 1990-91, but by the extreme or radical liberal wing of the democratic Russia. Yeltsin was cautious. He knew it would not this idea would not endear him to millions and millions of potential voters. So he and his strategist Gennady Burbulis had a sort of slightly different idea. It's an idea of a pyramid in reverse, consisting of 3 Slavic republics: Russian Federation, Ukraine, and Belarus, plus Kazakhstan. Why Kazakhstan? Simply because, you know, north of Kazakhstan is Russia. You know, they viewed it as, you know, of course, Slavic Kazakhstan, but of course the rest of Kazakhstan as well should be. So with those 4 republics, there should be bilateral economic treaties. There should be treaties of mutual recognition that internationally has no force whatsoever, but had huge symbolic force in that changing political context at the time. So, okay, Kravchuk, Leonid Kravchuk was rising as a politically talented leader of the Ukrainian communists, who sort of was the first to learn that legitimacy is no longer coming from the Politburo and this Leninist kind of revolutionary system. This is all bunk. You know, legitimacy is in the streets, legitimacy is in the balloting world. So he wasn't the first to realize it. But his rivals are the Ruch people. So all of a sudden, what he sees is November 1990, Yeltsin comes to Kiev, and it's a very interesting visit. Again, a footnote to history that I investigated a little bit more. Yeltsin comes with his strategists, including Burbulis, including others, offering basically Ukraine to erase 300 years of Russia's colonization of Ukraine. His rhetoric is amazing. His rhetoric is the decolonizing rhetoric. He says we should recognize each other as equals, including the current borders. And that immediately became a huge problem. Some people inside the Yeltsin circle said, current borders, and Crimea? What about Crimea and Donbass? Immediately. So Yeltsin dismissed it, because he needed allies. He needed allies against the center, against Gorbachev at that moment. So the treaty of November 1990 is crucial and important. I tried to find it in Russian. I couldn't. I found, of course, it in Ukrainian language, and the Ukrainian diaspora immediately, of course, publicized this treaty because it's a unique document. And later on in the 90s, every time when Russia and Ukraine almost came to blows and came to certain tension, Kravchuk would pick a phone, sort of call Yeltsin, say, you agreed in 1990 to treat, you know, us as equals and never raise territorial question. So this is a foundational document in a new relationship between Ukraine and Russia. Still not sovereign, still not independent, but of huge importance, this document. And one phrase is this in this document, if I find it, had a pretty tricky language. In Article 6, the signatories recognize and respect the territorial integrity of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, sorry for all this long, and the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic within the presently existing borders within the USSR, в рамках СССР. So later on, those liberal imperialists, let's call them this way, on the Russian side said, of course, we recognize it, but в рамках СССР, while USSR still existed, if USSR disappears, everything is up. And Ukrainians read it, of course, in a different way. So it's a classic tricky sentence that was interpreted differently by different sides. You know, after that, the story accelerates tremendously in 1991. You find that even in early 1991, Kravchuk and most of Ukrainian communist party, and that's enormous structure still encompassing all economic managers, of course, is attached to Moscow in economic sense and unwilling to raise the question of full independence in political sense. In fact, Kravchuk, during his at that time frequent trips to Moscow, confessed to British ambassador that for Ukraine, he said, it would be actually easier to exist with Russia within some kind of weaker, more tolerant liberal union, rather than having assertive, rising Russia as a separate state. And this Kravchuk's sentence, I think, reflects the new dilemmas, post-colonial, if you like, post-imperial dilemmas of both Ukraine and Russia. The more Yeltsin and Democrats pushed the envelope and undermined the center through ballot box, through rhetoric, by demanding Gorbachev to resign, by doing other things, by declaring war of laws and trying to seize some economic assets that were still Union property to Russia, the more it forced, I use the word forced deliberately, forced Ukrainians to respond. So the two republics became sort of symbiotically related in one way. The more sovereign Russia would become, the more sovereign Ukraine has to become. It's almost inevitable. And you find it during the early months of 1991, but then it becomes more and more accelerated. It's not clear whether Gorbachev had any chance of really creating a weak union, rather a confederation that would stand as a union. But we all know that the August coup disrupted those plans. But if we fantasize, you know, would Ukraine join such a union? It's impossible to say. But I think there was a chance, given what Kravchuk said, that it's better for us to be part of some kind of more complex structure where Russia's ambitions, imperialist and nationalist ambitions, would be checked somehow, rather than having full collapse of the union with assertive Russia, doesn't matter democratic or not, in any form and shape, facing an independent Ukraine. So it was quite interesting. Of course, the key events were after the August coup, when all of a sudden, and Plochy writes very well about it, and I found much more about this story, when all of a sudden the two republics were at loggerheads directly, because what happened after the self-destruction of the Union Center, Gorbachev's captivity, and all these events that we know from history, Kravchuk was in Moscow when Gorbachev lost its power to Yeltsin. He watched it. He returned back home. He was facing angry Ukrainian nationalists and RWO demanding that all communists should go. Kravchuk himself was, of course, implicated mildly in the coup himself. He didn't behave courageously during the coup at all. So for him, the dilemma was quite clear. to go together with nationalists and declare full independence, or maybe share a fate of Gorbachev in one way or another, but inside Ukraine, within the republic. So he chose the former. He chose very well. He also immediately decided that his presidential campaign, he would be a president of Ukraine, would be backed by the referendum, all-national referendum. All this comes from Kravchuk, not from Ruch, not from the Ruch people. The Ruch people said, we'll declare independence. That would be it. So Kravchuk played a much more interesting and complicated game. And the first reaction to this from Yeltsin was exactly according to this tricky phraseology. We gave Ukraine. We recognize that Crimea and Donbass are yours within the boundaries of the Soviet Union. Once you now saying that you want to break away from our Slavic whatever solidarity, guys, we have to raise this issue again. So during the last days of August, if you go to Ukrainian and some Moscow newspapers, they discuss scenario war in graphic and interesting details that completely replicate what really happened after 2014, and particularly, of course, in 2022. They couldn't predict that Ukraine would win and Russia would lose. That was pretty impossible. But they predicted a sort of a repetition of a Yugoslav scenario. So what prevented a sheer catastrophe that, could have just become an avalanche out of control of both sides? I think there were two factors. One factor was the fact that, was the position, very sensible this time and very prudent position of the Bush administration, that clearly declared to all the republics, Helsinki Act. Borders can be changed only peacefully, but Baker, in his declaration of the Helsinki Act, went even further. He didn't even mention peaceful change of the borders. That basically borders stay intact, period. So the United States became the power that sanctified Stalin-Lenin boundaries inside the Soviet Union. And they became immutable. They could no longer be changed. And the second factor, even more important, I would say, was desperate need of Yeltsin, the Russian elites, Kravchuk, and the Ukrainian elites to receive US recognition from the US-led liberal order. That was number one desire on their list. Not even independence, I should say, but that recognition. And those two factors created, again, a pretty unique situation when combustible energy, potentially dangerous forces that immediately began to rise, both in Ukraine and in Russia, were tamed at that time. The United States were particularly interested in denuclearization of Ukraine, and for simplicity's sake, to accumulate all Soviet assets of strategic importance, including nuclear weapons, within the Russian Federation. It's actually ironic today to read in the archives how Bush, Scowcroft, and Baker thought of a possibility of a Ukrainian-Russian conflict. Baker was writing already after the collapse in 1992, Ukrainians are paranoid about Russia. They're wrong. There would not be a war between Russia and Ukraine. The real threat for Ukraine is an ethnic conflict between Russian separatists in Donbass and Crimea and the Ukrainians. So, of course, failure of imagination, common for all of us. But nevertheless, at that time, it worked. At that time, it worked. And it looked like the trouble went away and would never return until it did. So I'd better stop because we need time for questions and discussion.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful. So we're going to kick off the Q&A. Please raise your hands and I will come and I will give the mic to you to ask the question. But first, if I may, capacity as the hosting party here, I will abuse this prerogative just once, I promise you. Professor Zubok, I would like to put a question to you. Reading your marvelous book, one thing that becomes very, very clear is that there was a tremendous failure of political will throughout the whole of the century, just kind of permeating everyone, and kind of an unwillingness to take steps, sometimes violent steps, that in the circumstances may have availed those parties. To what extent would you say the story of the dissolution of the Soviet Union is also a story of a failure of political imagination, that the people who were in control weren't able to devise bargains, political bargains domestically, internationally, that could have feasibly kept the whole structure? Is it a story of failure of political imagination to you at all, or were there basically no bargains at that point that could have availed?
Totally, I have to disagree with you on this. I think there was tremendous flight of political imagination, but in the wrong direction. If you think of what Gorbachev really wanted to do and wanted to create, and again, compare Gorbachev to that stark verdict of Bob Gates and Skolkrov, Russia would always be, always was, always would be this militaristic, autocratic, despotic son of creature. So the path dependency. Here comes Gorbachev, who probably never heard of the expression path dependency, and said, I will be Lenin too. I will be Lenin who would undo Lenin and Stalin together, and 1,000 years of Russian history. And it's amazing. Where is this lack of political imagination? I would say it's exorbitant political imagination. Had instead of Gorbachev, somebody, Mark Kramer said Grecian. I don't think Grecian would have ever qualified, but someone would have qualified to replace Gorbachev as the head of the Soviet Union. Nothing like that would have happened because what happened required enormous political imagination.
Please, yes, and introduce yourselves also.
Sure. Thank you for coming here. My name is Arch Davis. I'm an alum and informal associate with the Liechtenstein Institute. You asked what you would say to Putin if you met him. I think what I would say is Putin, ja, Rasputin. But rather than be a communicator to him, I think it's better to be a Putin whisperer so that you hear and understand what he's saying. And I have no trouble with that. Now, the common media here today, they assume something, oh, well, he's KGB and he's just trying to put the Soviet together again. So they start with a straw premise and then take it on in a place where Putin himself hasn't gone and there's no reason to think he would go. So the question is, Russia, and this is one of Putin's concerns, is always being attacked by somebody. Why do people hate Russia so much?
I don't think people hate Russia.
I mean, over hundreds of years, not thousands, but over hundreds of years, right? There's always something that they want to attack.
Remember,
Russia
1,000 years of wrong history. How you can beat it,
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Vlad, for that talk. I'm Mark Beisinger. I don't know if we've actually formally met, but of course we know each other. Yeah, I wanted to say one thing about your notion about Russia being at the center of it, and I absolutely agree with that, although I disagree with you as to why that came about, and that is because of the mass mobilizations of non-Russians, which influenced very strongly Russians, and who would never have imagined declaring sovereignty against the USSR had it not been for what was going on elsewhere in the USSR. But nevertheless, the thing that I kind of wondered from your talk in terms of thinking about the current conflict in Ukraine is, what I take away from what you say is that the problem in some ways was that Russia was asked to decolonize. And yet most of us, I think, today would argue that the problem is that Russia didn't decolonize enough. And I think that there's pretty wide rhetoric right now about decolonization of, Soviet studies or Russian studies or whatever you want to call it. And so I'm kind of wondering where your argument fits into an understanding of Russian empire, and not just sort of Russian state, but Russian empire, which has its 1,000-year history. Right. So we should just simply accept, and everybody who's subject to Russian authority should just accept its imperial rule, or what are you actually pointing to? So.
Well, it's a huge issue, and I'm not sure I agree with those liberals from democratic Russia who said in 1989 and 90 that until every ethnic minority in Russia would be allowed to go free, democracy, liberal democracy and whatever would never flourish, would never have a chance. I just disagree with it, because I think there's a false causality about it. There are plenty of empires who grew into democracy independently of the empire or with the empire. So, and nothing prevents Democrats from holding some kind of elections, or nothing prevented, for that matter, Gorbachev from running as a president of the entire Soviet Union. Some in the Baltic would have, or in Georgia would have boycotted it probably after 1988. The rest would have voted for him until some time later Yeltsin overtook him. So you can have the legitimacy of the ballot box supporting the realm, call it empire, call it whatever, call it federation or confederation, and preventing it from collapsing. So for me, those like Bonner who asked to decolonize the Soviet Union as a precondition or the cause of the reform of sine qua non before one could move to liberal democracy, were simply asking for trouble, because the idea of decolonization at the time was asking for more trouble, not for less trouble. It's so I think I'm on the more conservative side of this debate. I would say Gorbachev tinkered with the Constitution way too much. He should have done it once and for all, maybe creating the conditions under which even such a complex country would have survived, most of it, minus the Baltic states, probably. But I don't think that in Ukraine, even in Ukraine, there was enough of nationalism to create a moment for separation, until Russia itself, or the Russian Federation, created that unique opportunity for Ukraine to do so. That leaves me neutral on the whole debate. Will the world be better with a multitude of mono-ethnic so-called nation states or not? Or rather, why neutral? I think it's a very dangerous idea, actually. It's a very dangerous idea. I'm in favor of American way, somehow.
Another question here.
Yes, I'm Michael Reynolds. I teach in the Department of European Studies, and I'm the co-director of our program in History and the Practice of Diplomacy. I'm looking forward to reading your new book for two reasons. One is I guess I'm old enough now that events that I've witnessed and lived through are now proper history. But more importantly, I've enjoyed your prior publications and have used them successfully with my undergraduates. So thank you for that. In the beginning of your talk early on, you made a very intriguing point, I thought, when you suggested that had Gorbachev come 15 years earlier, things might have been very different. And what you pointed to, though, is the key factor would have been, I think you mentioned Washington's neoliberal policies. That is something external to the Soviet Union, in particular related to America. And I was wondering if you could expand on that. What might have been different? I'm not so interested in the thought experiment of imagining Gorbachev emerging or someone like him emerging in the early 1970s or late 1960s, but rather what might have been different, do you think, in the late 1980s that would have been outside the Soviet Union that might have led to a very different outcome?
Yeah, it's what if question, of course, immensely risky for me even to imagine what could have been done. But I know what happened. I know that the Bush administration deliberately killed the idea of a great bargain, which was an idea not of shelling out billions and billions of dollars to help the sinking Soviet economy, but rather an idea of creating an incentive, a sort of a currency board idea of creating, pulling together enormous amount of money for the Soviet Union, at least enormous. They were talking about the figure of $100 billion in order to dangle this in front of the Soviet bureaucracy and Soviet security apparatus and the republics, so that they would follow the lead of Gorbachev, who would be backed by this money, by this amount of money. And this is exactly what young economist Grigory Yavlinsky was saying at the time. It's interesting why the Bush administration not only rejected this idea, they refused even to explore this idea. It's one thing to say, oh, they thought it was impractical. No, they were hostile to this idea. And there were two things I think that are interlinked in their rejection of this idea. In their dialogue at G7 with other European leaders, with Canadian leader Mulroney and others, they said basically two things. That the Soviet Union is a wrong country with a wrong history, that whatever we do in America or externally, they said, would be really marginal. The whole fate of Gorbachev's reforms, or just whatever reforms that would change Russia or not, should be done inside Russia. Externals are marginal. This is number one thing. In reality, I think there was a lot of hostility and accumulated hostility to Russia and the Soviet Union as an embodiment of the other, everything un-American and anti-American. But what really allowed them to argue it more convincingly in front of their own allies, not Gorbachev, their own allies, Italians, British, Germans, and so on and so forth, aside from this, was the Washington Consensus. The argument was this would not work. Washington Consensus sets some preconditions. Before money would start coming, they must fulfill these preconditions, pretty much what Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela, and other countries of Latin America had to do before in the 70s. They have to do the same. And after that, the money may start coming. In other words, the idea of the Washington Consensus was that the country should invite international capital, not the states should create this amount of capital to trigger changes in another state. So this anti-statist and more, I would say, global idea of what money can do and how money can work appeared in the 80s. Had Gorbachev proposed the same kind of changes, including letting Eastern Europe go, changing the Soviet Union, opening the Soviet Union for international business back in the early 70s, that would have been a different consensus. And it would have been differently considered, which is a huge, of course, supposition. But I'm just trying to make an argument in this way.
Right. Evgeny Roshin, University Center for Human Values. I got really intrigued by one of the last remarks in your talk when the US statesmen believed that Russia would not attack Ukraine, that there would be no chance for war. And I would like to ask you to expand on that if you can, is what seems to me in this particular case is that they sort of, or you portray them, or they sort of were a little naive about
Americans.
Yeah, about Russia's, possible intentions. On the other hand, you keep telling that they were not so naive.
Not
that,
so naive.
They believed in the, wrong history that Russia had all this way. So I wonder what really actually made them think that Russia wouldn't attack. What were they driven by systemic considerations alone, according to which it is best to keep nuclear weapons in one center so that you ensure in this way non-proliferation and are able to deter Moscow? Or did they have faith in democratic movement within Russia, perhaps in the federative system that Yeltsin might have promised to develop?
Mm-hmm. Well, you pointed to some of the ingredients of that. I wouldn't call it faith in Russian. Yeah, I would say they were impressed by how far the Russian democratic movement was prepared to go to leave the past behind. And in particular, I think two figures, Bush and Baker, particularly Baker, were deeply impressed by human contacts with those people in Moscow. They were less impressed by their encounters with non-Russian nationalists, ironically, because they recognized that what Americans always treated as a wrong type of nationalism in Europe. I mean, they went to Central Asia and found strong anti-Russian feelings. They went to the Baltic, whose independence they always sort of de facto recognized, and found vicious anti-Russian feelings there. So whenever they traveled outside Moscow, they encountered hateful, bileful, bilious nationalism. In Moscow, they found those idealists, ironically. So I would just qualify Americans, and I'm speaking specific about the group of people in the Republican administration. They were remarkably correct in terms of longer-term horizons, in terms of path dependency. And I would say, yes, path dependency existed. You don't have to turn it into historical determinism, of course, but path dependency was powerful enough. But they also had a shorter-term tactical horizons as well. For instance, I mentioned, they didn't quite trust Gorbachevian reforms, and they were right. But at the same time, they tactically recognized that keeping Gorbachev in power would give them, as Baker put it after his first meeting with Gorbachev, I think it was in February 1989, Gorbachev is treading the waters of perestroika. He's desperate to have our support. I think he's ready to pay the price. That's the language of realpolitik. That's the language of peace through strength, where strength would be ensured by US leadership. And they mince no words about it within the administration. Not those idealists. They treated Reagan, by the way, as a crazy idealist, charmed by Gorbachev. So, I'm sure on Gorbachev's side, there were also conflicting different horizons. His grand vision, and countering many, many years of Russian and Soviet history, tactical vision, where he increasingly became frustrated by the Americans and generally by the West for just asking him to do more and to do more, and he needed more and more support that was not provided until Kohl began to shell out huge amount of money to him in compensation for unification of Germany. That was one big exception. So on both sides, there were different horizons, tactical, strategic, grand strategic, kind of thinking this language, different aspects of their motivation and their behavior. And they sometimes clash, sometimes they conflated, sometimes they interacted, you know, in various ways.
Michael Gordon from the History Department. It's good to see you again. I'm not disagreeing with the interpretation, but I want to hear you clarify the two causal mechanisms you have here. So most of the conversation has been about Gorbachev. He's on the cover of the book. He weakens the center.
It's not my choice.
And I'm sure, I know that
You
the
know,
author,
what
the
my
author
choice
never has the
was?
choice.
Soviet rubles.
But
They
even,
said no.
But even that, so he weakens the center, etc. But the explosion is Yeltsin, and you don't attribute as much blame there.
I do. Read the book.
But it seems like in the conversation here, all of the causation is starting more with Gorbachev producing a set of conditions.
Yes.
So without, I don't want to ask the counterfactual about what happens without Yeltsin, but it seems like especially for the origins of the Ukraine war, it's Yeltsin that you're putting the finger on, not Gorbachev's condition, because he's the one who starts the agreement, who starts talking about territorial integrity, who starts generating those arguments. I just want you to clarify where the Gorbachev blame and the Yeltsin blame work. I'm just trying to figure that out.
Well, what is the phrase? At the beginning was Gorbachev. At the beginning was the word, right? At the beginning was the word of Gorbachev, then the act of Gorbachev. Then in one of his kind of realistic memos drafted by Condoleezza Rice in February 1991, Scowcroft wrote, all this Yeltsin is a creature of bizarre governance by Gorbachev. So this is causality for you, Michael. Causality is bizarre governance of Gorbachev created Yeltsin. That's it. Because Yeltsin, transformation of Yeltsin from sort of, a Bukharinite Bolshevik wishing people grow rich within socialism into, ultra neoliberal guy who wanted to decolonize the Soviet Union, but not Russia. Not Russia. That was the limit. Everything outside the Russian Federation. That was also in part his attempt to find his voice next to Gorbachev. There was Gorbachev who was lionized by the world, who later received his Nobel Peace Prize. And here was Yeltsin, who kept saying to everyone, but they didn't listen, Gorbachev would fail, Gorbachev would fail, listen to me, Gorbachev would fail. I can do better than Gorbachev. So there was a twin kind of, brother of Gorbachev trying to find his voice and suddenly discovering I can only destroy the center by recreating Mother Russia. And, this is my joker in this poker game. And this turned out it's such a joker of such power that it just destroyed everything.
I'm Gunhild Haagensen-Gjørv, and I'm visiting from the University of Tromsø, the Arctic University of Norway, and I'm professor in security and geopolitics. So I'm not a historian. I'm one of those dreaded political scientists that takes sort of a historical kind of analyses. So I want to get into one of those, because I thank you so much for a fantastic deep dive into the history here, and just where you're arguing where many of the kernels of the current events have started. And this is an interesting thing to talk about. And you were talking about sovereignty and the respect for sovereignty looking at also from the side of the United States for the Helsinki Act and saying, well, the borders, they will stay fixed, they stop here. Then you listen to some of my colleagues, political scientists, who are taking a neo-realist view, which pretty much annihilates sovereignty and just taking a look at these spheres of interest, stating then that the United States has the power to pretty much convince all of the Eastern Europeans and the Baltics to not want to be a part of Russia. Somehow that was their influence. as well as the fact that the United States, and here United States, NATO, and the West are all conflated, right? Are the cause behind this war, because they had not respected, in fact, sovereignty, that they were influencing these states to, come over to the dark side, which is NATO and such. So there's an interesting.
NATO's the dark side. Interesting.
It depends on your perspective, but I find it's very interesting, these different acts and moves by the United States, and also most importantly, what you're highlighting, what was happening in Russia and how instrumental that was. I'm curious about what was happening in Russia in relation to these things that the United States was doing. The claims are being made that somehow the United States and its actions were far more powerful than what was happening in Russia itself. And that would be under Clinton, with that whole not 1 inch, but then there was a little bit more than an inch, and what that inch meant, or the Bucharest Declaration of 2008 from NATO saying, sure, Ukraine and Georgia come on in to NATO. So I'm curious about that relationship, where the power for what we're looking at now resides, because it is I don't think it's a compelling argument, but it nevertheless seems to be very convincing many that this is all the US's fault.
Well, there's some point. I would say, of listening to what you just said. By the way, I've been to Tromsø, have some great memories of never setting sun there. But speaking of the kingdom of darkness, but in a sense, what makes me think US to what extent it was powerful or not, limitations. You have the debate inside the US administration, and they stress their limitations, particularly with regard to Russia, but not Eastern Europe. And they say, Eastern Europe, we must lock it in. They want to be part of Europe, and we must help them to be part of Europe. And in a set of memos, they say, if we include Eastern Europe, meaning of course not the Soviet Union, but Baltic, Poland, all these countries, into European structures, will strengthen US hegemony, and we strengthen US leadership. Well, hegemony is a bad word. Leadership in Europe, because those people like us. Those people like America, and they lean on us in against all kinds of threats, including Russia, and above all, Russian threat. So by adding Eastern Europe, I was surprised to discover it. It was in Baker's papers actually today. It says quite clearly it's in our national interests to add Eastern Europe economically and just geopolitically and all that. And by the way, point like 8 during that laundry list of positive things, it may stimulate reforms in the Soviet Union as well. It's kind of, that thing, very marginal thing. So I would even raise the question, maybe for discussion at some point, from what time we should start the unipolar moment, the American unipolar moment. Because it started not after the Soviet collapse. It started before the Soviet collapse. I would add almost like 2 years easily to the chronology of unipolar moment, when Americans, although maybe they didn't know it and underestimated it, they could do pretty much whatever they wanted to do, almost, or at least a lot, as the only real superpower remaining, because it's hard to consider the Soviet Union as a superpower aside from the sheer, amount of nukes and missiles and tanks since the spring, summer of 1989, maybe, even before the wall fell. So yes, Americans could do a lot, but not everything, of course.
I believe we have some online questions also. I want to get at least one online question. Ujong.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I'm going
want to read a question on Zoom for the participants.
Sure.
In December 1991, the European community had took steps towards recognizing the constituent parts of the USSR and Yugoslavia as independent states. Was this an important step towards losing sight of the balances implicit in the Helsinki principles?
The last phrase, could you repeat, please?
Was this an important step towards losing sight of the balances implicit in the Helsinki?
Oh, balance in Helsinki principles. Well, I don't think the Europeans had any major role in formulating those principles at the end of 1991. What really, back to our conversation about the unipolar moment, US leadership is remarkable. I mean, maybe it's real coincidence with the fact that Baker, Bush, Scowcroft were no-nonsense realists of old school, sort of, without all those vision things, as Bush famously said. And the fact that whenever the United States said something, and to G7 allies, to European Economic Community, to anyone, Delors, whatever, they usually said yes. I mean, Americans were reasonable. Let's face it; they were reasonable in setting the agenda. But nevertheless, many Western Europeans disagreed with that agenda on some points, and yet had to support it. That is a true hegemony in action, I think, quite powerful hegemony in action. What I think was also important, it was American decision, well, to set the borders, of course, to set the borders in stone, the Soviet internal borders between the republics that existed only on the map. They never existed in reality. And they became real, as we know, and they became bleeding later on between Ukraine and Russia. And not only between some other republics, as we know. But it also sort of Americans, in fact, supported by the Brits, backed the idea of Russia's primacy. And that's another interesting thing that happened in 1991. People sometimes ask a question, who appointed Yeltsin's Russia as a legal successor to the Soviet Union? Certainly Yeltsin wanted it. He wanted it. Some of his entourage who were thinking about those things and understood those things, they also wanted it. But it was Anglo-American decision. Anglo-American decision. It's widely documented how they didn't want to reform the Security Council at the time. They were Americans were starkly against any reform of Security Council. They thought that Russia should be the sole depository of all nuclear weapons. Hence, the immediate conflict with the Ukrainians, who didn't want to give away their nukes, despite the proclamation of becoming a nuclear-free state. They used those nukes as a bargain in various ways under Kravchuk for at least 3 more years, beyond 1991. But the United States were very strict, and they played not only the role of benign traffic controller guiding Gorbachev and the Soviet Union onto the ash heap of history, but they played a very stern role of a teacher and for all those other non-Russian republics, particularly in Ukraine, that they shouldn't, they must give up their nuclear weapons. The language was very harsh. They must give up nuclear weapons, not as a quid pro quo for American assistance. They would never get American assistance for this. They just must give up those weapons. That's the language of a great power.
Vlad, this has been such an interesting discussion, and it's so much richer than I thought, since I haven't read the book yet, but I intend to. I wanted to
You're
ask
not free from the obligation to read it now.
No, I'm going to read it. Anyway, I was living in the Soviet Union right after the fall of the Soviet Union. And what I found so strange is that the people who were coming into Moscow, like almost parachuting in, the IMF, the World Bank, none of it was coordinated. And they came and said, well, we're going to build you a stock market, which sent all of my friends into a tizzy of laughter. So why do we need, comrades, we don't have any money. Why do we need a stock market? And why was that effort so discombobulated from the US? Why wasn't it better? Who was in charge of guiding it, if anybody?
Oh, the answer is very simple, actually. No one was in charge.
Parents.
You know, the head of the Russian section, whose name, Odlismy, I think his name was, Brit, a wonderful person. He was afraid, he didn't want that task. The task came from the Houston G7 summit. And essentially came as a way of passing the buck, classically, to IMF and World Bank. So when people blame the experts of IMF and bank in whatever happened, I think it's wrong. The leaders said, we cannot do anything. We cannot help Gorbachev. Let him receive the recommendations. It was said in a very nice language. Latin America never received recommendations, as we know, from Washington. It received the orders. But Gorbachev was, had to be treated with tact and respect. And so they received recommendations from the IMF. And because no one understood it, it's in the book, by the way, no one could write anything meaningful about how to reform the Soviet economy. They delegated it to a bunch of junior economists from the who came from the former bloc, some Hungarian descent, Polish descent, and some other guys there. And they wrote something that, okay, if, this is what Gorbachev should do in order to fulfill the credentials of Washington Consensus, but we're sorry, then the Soviet Union falls apart automatically. And they came to Odlismy read it, was horrified. They said, no, this was not a mandate from the G7. We want to keep Gorbachev in power. So you see this kind of strange story when IMF did not quite do what they wanted, World Bank did not quite do. No one had a set of recipes exactly fitting how to reform the Soviet Union and still keep Gorbachev in power. Until, well, frankly, if they asked somebody like me, and I was not even there at that point, I would have said it's impossible. You have to choose, right? Either you keep Gorbachev in power, then please open your purse, create a sort of even a mirage of a Marshall Plan with $100 billion. Not really necessary to pay this money, but to create a mirage. Then you may keep Gorbachev in power longer. Or you insist on preconditions, such as you insist, and then no more Gorbachev. Yeltsin comes, but bad guys also come, like Zhirinovsky maybe. Bad nationalists come to power, and then you have trouble. Then you have trouble. This is really what happened.
Thank you so much, Professor Zubok, for a wonderful talk. We're going to wrap up the Q&A at this point. There is a reception waiting for us outside. There's going to be some food, some bites for you to mingle, get to know each other, talk a little bit informally afterwards as well.
Thank you very
But
much.
first, please join me in thanking Professor Zubok for a wonderful talk. And for our in-person audience and also our virtual audience, I want to let you know that there will be another meeting of the World Order Colloquium happening on Monday, April the 3rd at 4:30 p.m. Also running to 6. There will not be a reception after that meeting. That will be with Professor Yang Shui Tong of Tsinghua University, and he will be speaking to the Sino-American antagonism. So please join us for that. An announcement will also be circulated. That will be in A71 Louis Simpson. Thank you.